During World War II, the insecticide DDT was used to kill mosquitoes, which spread malaria, and lice, which spread typhus. DDT was so effective that after the war it was used worldwide. But by the end of the 1940s, problems with DDT began to appear in the environment. Many insects developed resistance to DDT, and it was found to be poisonous to fish. Adding to the problem, scientists have learned that DDT is not metabolized very quickly by animals. Instead, it's deposited and stored in fatty tissues. If an animal ingests DDT over a period of time, the amount in the body builds up. To keep DDT from reaching toxic levels in humans and other animals, DDT was banned in the United States in 1973. But if we took samples, we'd find that tissues from every human on Earth today contain DDT. The reason DDT is everywhere is that the Earth is a large global ecosystem. An ecosystem is all the organisms living in a community and all the non-living material with which they interact. The global ecosystem is made up of many local ecosystems. Ecosystems vary greatly in size, from a small terrarium to a tropical forest or savanna. The boundaries of ecosystems are not usually clear because air, water, soil, and even some organisms can move between them. Within an ecosystem, material is continuously cycled from one location to another, and often from one chemical form to another. DDT is chemically stable, so it doesn't change its form. But because of the movement of material through and between ecosystems, DDT is found in every body of water, in all soil, and most likely in every organism on Earth. In this activity, we'll look at how material moves through an ecosystem by studying the feeding relationships among the organisms in an ecosystem. Then we'll discuss how energy flows through an ecosystem and how water cycles through an ecosystem. DDT is found in water, soil, and organisms all over the Earth. DDT was originally used on plants and soil, but now it is found in most organisms. This is because of the feeding relationships among the organisms in an ecosystem. The feeding relationships within an ecosystem can be grouped into trophic levels, based on the organism's main source of nutrition. For the most part, the organisms in the first trophic level are photosynthetic organisms. They use light energy to synthesize organic compounds. These autotrophs are known as primary producers. On land, the main primary producers are plants. In lakes and oceans, aquatic plants, algae, and cyanobacteria are the main primary producers. Primary producers support all other organisms in an ecosystem. The organisms in the trophic levels above the primary producers are heterotrophs. Organisms that survive by consuming primary producers are called primary consumers. Since they eat mostly plants, the primary consumers are usually herbivores. Organisms that eat herbivores are carnivores, which make up the secondary consumers. Carnivores that eat carnivores are tertiary consumers. There can be even higher-level consumers, carnivores that eat carnivores that eat carnivores. Omnivores feed on primary producers and at least one level of consumers. A group of consumers called the detritivores link all of the trophic levels. Detritivores obtain energy from detritus. Detritus is non-living organic material, including the remains of dead organisms, leaves, and feces. Because of how they get energy, detritivores are sometimes called decomposers. Detritivores are generally prokaryotes and fungi, but some animals, like earthworms, also feed on detritus. To follow the path between trophic levels, we can build a food chain. A food chain shows how food is transferred between levels. Usually, feeding relationships of the organisms in an ecosystem aren't as simple as the food chain shown here. Several primary consumers may feed on the same primary producer. Some higher-level consumers may feed on several levels of lower consumers. It is easier to interlink the feeding relationships in an ecosystem into a food web. A food web shows how some organisms feed at several different trophic levels. All levels of the web are connected to the detritivores. This food web shows the particular organisms involved. The diagram can be simplified to show what trophic level each organism occupies. Some food webs don't explicitly state what each branch point represents, but we can figure it out. Since all organisms are food for H must represent the detritivores. Organism A doesn't have a food source on the diagram, so it must represent a primary producer. B, C, and D feed on the primary producer, so they must be primary consumers. D also feeds on C, so it's a secondary consumer. In this way, we can figure out the trophic level of each symbol in the food web. To see how well you understand food webs, drag the labels to the appropriate letter. Click Submit to see if you're correct. Sorry, that's not right. All organisms are food for C, so it's a detritivore. B has no food source, so it's a primary producer. D has only B as a food source, so it's a primary consumer. F has both B and D as food sources, so it's a primary secondary consumer. A has D and F as food sources, making it a secondary tertiary consumer. E feeds on A, making it a tertiary quaternary consumer. Within an ecosystem, the primary producers support all other organisms. Without autotrophs, there would be no way to convert solar energy into chemical energy, and all heterotrophic organisms would die. We've discussed how food moves through an ecosystem. Now let's see how this dictates energy flow through an ecosystem. In almost all ecosystems, the energy originally enters as light from the sun. Energy can't be recycled, so it must be constantly supplied. Primary producers convert the solar energy to chemical energy through photosynthesis. The total energy in an ecosystem depends on the photosynthetic activity of the primary producers. Each day, around 10 to the 22nd joules of solar energy reach the Earth's atmosphere. Most of the solar radiation is absorbed or reflected by the atmosphere. The small amount that reaches the planet is mostly absorbed or reflected by bare ground and water. Only a small fraction of energy reaches photosynthetic organisms. Of that, only 1 to 2% of the solar energy is converted to chemical energy. Even with all of the lost energy, Earth's primary producers produce around 170 billion tons of organic material each year. Some ecosystems convert more solar energy than others. As an indication of how efficient a particular ecosystem is at converting solar energy, we can calculate its primary productivity. Primary productivity is the amount of light energy converted to chemical energy in a given amount of time. Not all of the chemical energy produced is available to be passed on to primary consumers. Primary producers use some of the energy themselves for cellular respiration. The total primary productivity of primary producers is called the gross primary productivity. Gross primary productivity minus the energy used by the primary producers is the energy available, or net primary productivity. As we can see, energy is lost as it passes through the primary producers. Primary productivity is often expressed as a rate, the mass of vegetation produced per unit time, grams per square meter per year, which is known as biomass. Biomass is usually calculated as dry mass, because the energy in water is not usable energy. It is important to remember that biomass is a rate. Don't confuse it with standing crop biomass, which is the dry crop mass at a particular time. Different ecosystems have differences in primary productivity and how much they contribute to the total primary productivity on Earth. An ecosystem's contribution depends on both the biomass and the size of the ecosystem. For example, beds of algae have a very high net primary productivity, but they only cover a tiny portion of the Earth, so their overall contribution is small. The open ocean has a very small net primary productivity, but it covers around 65% of the Earth, so its overall contribution is great. Now that we've looked at the energy transfer by primary producers, let's explore what happens when the energy is transferred to consumers. The rate at which consumers convert chemical energy from food into new body mass is called secondary productivity. Energy is lost between each trophic level. Organisms use some of the energy they get from their food for cellular respiration. This energy is lost from the ecosystem. Energy is also lost in the feces. This energy remains in the ecosystem thanks to the detritivores. Only the energy stored as new body mass at each trophic level is available for the next level. Most of the chemical energy from primary producers is never consumed by primary consumers. This is why when you look at most ecosystems, they are green from the plant material that isn't consumed. To keep track of how much energy is lost between each level, we can look at ecological efficiency, the percentage of energy transferred from one trophic level to the next. Most organisms have an ecological efficiency between 5 and 20%. This means that 80 to 95% of the total energy is not transferred from level to level. We can show the energy loss between levels graphically. In a pyramid of productivity, the biomass of each level is shown as a block. The blocks for the different levels are stacked to form a pyramid. A pyramid of productivity is generally very bottom-heavy because of the inefficient transfer of energy between levels. If we assume an ecological efficiency of 10% at each level, we see how quickly the biomass decreases. Tertiary consumers have only 0.1% of the biomass of primary producers. The energy loss can also be represented by the standing crop biomass of each level called a biomass pyramid. A biomass pyramid has the same basic shape as a pyramid of productivity. A third type of pyramid can be used to demonstrate energy loss between levels. In a pyramid of numbers, each block represents the number of individuals in each level. Since energy is lost between levels, fewer organisms are found in each level as we move up the pyramid. In an ecosystem, there are far more primary producers than high-level consumers. While energy must be constantly supplied, water and some elements are continuously recycled. Let's look at how water moves through and between ecosystems. About 71% of the Earth's surface is covered by water, so it isn't surprising that only a small amount of Earth's water is found in living organisms. But water is essential for life. Water cycles from the oceans to the air to the land and back to the oceans. The movement of water transfers other materials as well, including carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. The movement of water through and between ecosystems is called the water cycle. Most of the water cycle occurs between oceans and the atmosphere. Evaporation is caused by solar energy. Over oceans, the amount of evaporation is greater than the amount of precipitation. The excess water vapor is moved by the wind from over the ocean to over land. Over land, the level of precipitation is greater than the amount of evaporation and transpiration of water by plants. The excess water returns to the ocean as runoff and groundwater. The water cycle moves important nutrients through ecosystems. Nutrients and minerals are moved from ecosystem to ecosystem by runoff and precipitation. Harmful materials, like DDT, are also spread by the water cycle. Weathering and erosion caused by the movement of water free inorganic nutrients from rocks. The minerals become free in the soil and are available for use by primary producers. In this activity, we've looked at how energy flows through an ecosystem. Light energy is constantly supplied by the sun and converted to chemical energy by primary producers, the autotrophs. Primary producers are food for primary consumers, mainly the herbivores. Primary consumers are eaten by secondary consumers, which are carnivores. Secondary consumers are eaten by tertiary consumers, and so on. Omnivores feed on primary producers and at least one level of consumer. Detritivores, or decomposers, feed on non-living organic material and are the link between all trophic levels. The feeding relationships in an ecosystem can be shown using a food chain or a more elaborate food web. It is rare to have trophic levels higher than quaternary consumers because energy is lost between each trophic level. Primary producers convert light energy to chemical energy through photosynthesis. Net primary productivity is an indication of how efficient the primary producers of an ecosystem are at converting the energy. Primary productivity can be expressed as biomass, the mass of dry vegetation produced in a given amount of time. Biomass is a rate and shouldn't be confused with standing crop biomass, which is the dry mass of a crop at a particular time. Different ecosystems have different primary productivities, and they contribute different amounts to Earth's total primary productivity. Secondary productivity is the rate at which consumers convert the chemical energy from food into new body mass. Energy is lost between each trophic level. Only the energy stored as body mass in one trophic level is available for the next level. Generally, the ecological efficiency of each level is around 5 to 20%, so 80 to 95% of the energy is lost at each level. The loss of energy can be diagrammed in several ways. A pyramid of productivity, a biomass pyramid, and a pyramid of numbers all show how energy is lost. Each pyramid is very bottom-heavy, because the amount of energy converted by primary producers is much greater than the energy that is passed to higher-level consumers. While energy must be continuously supplied by the sun, water is recycled. The water cycle is the movement of water from the oceans to land and back to the oceans. As it moves, the water transfers nutrients within and between ecosystems. Now that we understand the movement of energy and water, let's use this knowledge to explore the presence of the insecticide DDT. DDT was originally used on plants and soil, but now it can be found everywhere. This is because of feeding relationships and the water cycle. DDT is picked up from the soil by primary producers. It is then passed to primary consumers, then to secondary consumers, and so on. DDT used in one ecosystem is transferred to other ecosystems through the water cycle. The spread of DDT is one example of why it's so important to keep all ecosystems free of hazardous materials. We can all do our part by disposing of toxic materials properly and keeping our water supplies from contamination by pollution and waste.